Um, well, as you know, my name is Vladimir Pozner, and I grew up in New York City, basically, in the Village. I don't know if you're familiar with New York. I went to school there, first to a private school, then to Stuyvesant High School. And to a certain extent, I've always considered myself to be American, because that's where I grew up, and that's the first language I really spoke fluently, along with French, because my mother was French and I was born in Paris. But actually, I spoke English. I probably had a larger vocabulary in English than I did in French, because outside of the house, it was always all English. And what's more, I was a Yankee fan, and I got to, yes, I even got to know Joe DiMaggio. You're not going to believe this. I have a ball signed by Joe DiMaggio. And I became a U.S. citizen, but much later. But I always had this sense of being American as well as French. And much later, when my parents moved to the Soviet Union, trying to figure out who I was quite a problem. And I'm still trying to figure it out. So anyway, that's just, if you have any personal questions, you can go ahead. I was sent some questions by Sharon, questions that you had asked her to send on. And I can start by answering these, or would you prefer just to shoot your questions at me right now without these? It's up to you. I can do either one of those.
Just use those.
So, what do we do?
Just use those.
All right, the first question was, or is rather, how have you survived all these years not supporting Putin? Well, as you see, I have survived. You don't have to support Putin to survive in this country. Putin is not Stalin, and we're not living in the Soviet Union. We are living in a semi-democratic country. I wouldn't call it democratic. It's got certain aspects that could be called democratic, but it's got a long way to go. But there are opposition newspapers, not many of them, but they exist. And I would say in parentheses that I don't quite understand what it is to be an opposition newspaper, because journalists are not supposed to be opposition or pro. They're supposed to be objective. Today in Russia, there is no such thing as objective journalism. And to be quite frank with you, I think there's very little of it in the United States today. You take sides. And of course, in this country, where most of the major media is controlled directly or indirectly by the government, usually called the Kremlin, whatever that means, that media reflects the government viewpoint. But you don't have to agree with it. There's a couple of television stations, there's one radio station in Moscow, I'm speaking now about Moscow, and there are a couple of newspapers that are opposition. And they exist, and they're very much alive, and they're extremely anti-Putin. I could only compare it to the degree of anti-Trumpism that now you have in a lot of the American press, including what I always considered to be the more balanced press, like the New York Times or the New Yorker magazine, which, I mean, they're just going overboard. It's not that I'm a Trump fan, but again, what about journalism? What about trying to furnish information and letting people draw their own conclusions rather than telling them what's right or what's wrong? I used to be a member of the Communist Party. I was a very, very strong supporter of that idea, the idea of a communist society. And for many years, I was a propagandist. I worked in an organization that you could call the equivalent of the Voice of America. I don't know if you know that particular radio station. You can't hear it in the U.S. That's not allowed by Congress because it's a government-run organization. But anyway, in the Soviet Union, there was an organization called Gosteleradio, and it had a foreign broadcast department, and I worked in the American department, and I broadcast to the United States on shortwave. Of course, not many people listened, maybe 3 or 4, but still, because Americans aren't really interested in any kind of broadcast from abroad, understandably. But I was a propagandist, and I supported a system that I gradually came to understand was wrong. And it took me a long time to admit to myself that I was doing something I should not do. Because when you believe in something profoundly and then your belief becomes, for whatever reason, you begin to lose it, it's very hard to admit. I'm not going to go into details here unless you have questions, but anyway, because of that, because of the kind of problems I had with that, I left the Communist Party well before it was fashionable to do so. And I promised myself that I would never again work for any party. I would never again support any government. I would never again be a propagandist. I would try to be a journalist, which is to say, be objective as much as I could, because after all, I'm not a robot. Be truthful, and we all know when we're not. And try to furnish as much information as I possibly can or could without trying to convince my audience that this is right or that's wrong. Here it is, and now draw your own conclusions. And I've been able to do that. I've been able to do that, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why, and I find it somewhat difficult to say this, but it's part of what that's the picture that I'm trying to project here. It's one of the reasons why I am pretty much respected in this country, both by those who like me and dislike me, because I refuse to take sides. And a lot of people don't like me because of that. Both the anti-Putin people and the pro-Putin people. They're saying, whose side are you on? And I say, I'm on the side of my audience. And so that's why I have been able to survive. Survive as a journalist, because nobody's being shot. It's not the Gulag. It's a completely different setup. And as I'm speaking to you now, you can probably feel that. There were times when to speak like that would have been very difficult. Someone might be waiting for me outside. Could I lose my job as a journalist? Yes, quite easily. In other words, I don't work for anybody. I produce a show called Pozner, and they buy it. Channel 1 buys it. They could say easily, well, we don't want it anymore. And that's it. And nobody else would take it in this country. So I'd lose my job. And that's quite possible. I mean, clearly if Mr. Putin really, really was fed up with what I do, and I know he doesn't like me, then, it could happen. And that's why I say that this is only a semi-democratic country, because as differing from the United States, in that sense, if the president were to call up a newspaper and say, fire so-and-so, you wouldn't get very far. On the other hand, if the head of, I don't know, J.P. Morgan or something would call up, you might get a better result. But Anyway, so that's a long answer to a short question. I'm going to try to be shorter. Today, tensions are extremely high. Could you do the same as in the 80s with someone like Senator Rand Paul or Tulsi Gabbard, or perhaps on Tucker Carlson's Fox program? Well, the answer to that is yes, if I were invited to. I mean, the show that I did with Phil back in the 90s, 91 to 97, was because Phil Donahue invited me. Said, would you like to do a show with me? And I thought, wow, with Phil Donahue. I didn't even know if I could do it. Phil in those days was, the #1 guy, and I was nobody. People knew me because I had appeared on American television from Moscow via satellite on Nightline, but still, it was a. But anyway, I was there for 6 years until a gentleman. I hesitate to use that word. Roger Ailes basically killed the show because he felt it was too liberal, and that speaks about freedom of the press. We were supposed to have our contract renewed, and we had the best rating in our time slot. And he called us in He became president of CNBC, which is where we were on. And he said, we will renew your contract provided it has a clause stating that you must inform us in advance about what you're going to speak and who you're going to invite. And I said, Mr. Ailes, that's censorship, isn't it? And he said, and this is a quote, "I don't give a rat's ass what you call it, but that's the way it's going to be." And I said, "No, I have not come from Moscow to be censored by you." And he said, "Well, we will not renew your contract." And that's exactly what happened. And the show just disappeared. And nobody really, there was no front page, what happened to this show? Whereas if something like that had happened here, it would be front page news, wouldn't it? Anyway, so if I were given the possibility, I would certainly do it. I have had no offers. Why was Russia's transition to capitalism so much more difficult than China's? Whoever gave you the idea that China is capitalism? Capitalism, among other things, means democracy, doesn't it? It means elections? No? Capital just means private ownership? And that's all? Well, I would think not. I mean, if you were to ask the Chinese if their country is a capitalist one, you'll get the answer that no, we are a communist country. One party, right? No elections, no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, one man who's been now appointed president until his death. And what's that? That's capitalism?
No.
Of course not. So I don't think that there has been that transition. They've been able to balance in a very, I would say, clever way, a political system and an economic system that are really not compatible. And I feel that one day it's going to burst. But that's the way it is now. So I wouldn't say that it's been much easier in China. What's more, I'm not a Chinese expert. I think, analyze why in one country it's harder than another. I think you have to know the history. You have to know the religion. You have to know how it evolved and why it evolved the way it did. So, I can't really address that question, and I don't think that's the case anyway. And even today in Russia, the idea of wealth, on the one hand, is something people very much desire because of everything it brings. But on the other hand, it's something people despise because that's the way they were educated for a long time. Somehow the idea of having a lot of money was looked down upon. And in Soviet times, money really didn't mean much. You couldn't buy you couldn't buy a big apartment, for instance, because you were limited by law. The square feet of your apartment depended on how many people were in the family, and you couldn't pay more for it. So, and things like that. I mean, you couldn't have a yacht, you couldn't have this, that, or the other. You couldn't have a private plane, you couldn't travel abroad, you couldn't do this, couldn't do that. So money was important, but not in the way it is today in Russia, where money is pretty much everything. And not only in Russia. Based on the fact that President Bush and James Baker reneged on their promise not to expand NATO, does it surprise you that President Trump is so strongly opposed by the American political class, the U.S. mainstream media, nearly everyone in Congress, and all the think tanks? I really don't know. I don't know whether they're opposed to him because he doesn't seem to be very supportive of NATO. I don't think that you can, draw that straight line. That may be part of the picture. In fact, I really, I find it difficult to logically explain to myself why the so-called liberal newspapers, they're not that liberal really, but anyway, are so anti-Trump. What is really the issue? It can't be NATO. There have to be some other things there. So what is it that, rubs them the wrong way?
Russia.
Well, Russia, when Trump made his more or less positive statements during the election campaign about Russia, I mean, I was one of many who thought, well, you know, it's refreshing to hear that, but let's not go overboard on this. You know, this is an election campaign, so the man's looking for votes, and maybe he thinks that this could attract some people. It could be that. It could be. But, you know, again, I don't like to make, you know, definite statements if I don't really know. So I'm just going to leave that one alone.
Mr. Pozner, maybe Russia, but it may also be an antagonism towards what Trump is viewed as representing.
Could be.
A populism.
Yes, very much could be. Very much could be that. Can civil society in Russia withstand another wave of sanctions? I think the answer to that is, beyond a question of the doubt, yes. Now, the Russians are very tough. And they're strongest when things are bad. When things are very good, that's when they're not very strong. It's a strange thing. But you know, the saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, well, that's pretty much the Russians. When things are really bad, that's when they hunker down and can handle just about anything. And there are people who are used to difficult times. They've had a very short period when things bloomed and blossomed and they could buy whatever they want and they had money and a degree of freedom and were able to travel and all of that. That's been really a few years. But if you look at the history of Russia, a country that enslaved its own people, I mean, until 1861, most of the Russians were slaves. You know, it was like the blacks in America, but the blacks were imported. These were not. So this is a country that had a slave mentality for a long time. And they're used to tough times, especially when they have the feeling that the suffering that they're going through is not their own fault, that it's inflicted by someone, by an enemy of sorts, in this case, the United States. So definitely they can. At least that's my view. Do you ever feel that as Russia's #1 TV icon, that's a bit of an exaggeration, you have such a profound seat of influence that you daily contribute to shaping modern Russia? Does this thought or responsibility ever terrify you? I think I have a responsibility. I think every journalist has a responsibility. And the fact that, for a variety of reasons, I have influence makes me super, how should I put this, hyper aware of my responsibility. And when I travel around the country and do public speaking, I'm amazed by the fact that not only are the halls full, but it's mainly young people. And that's very surprising because I'm anything but young. So why would people come to listen to an 84-year-old man? Young people is a surprise, but it does mean that what I have to say rings a bell for them. And it is a bit of a scary responsibility. But on the other hand, it's one I cherish, because it's great to know that what you're saying, what you're doing, what you're trying to explain is important to other people. Otherwise, why do the job? What's the sense of it if it makes no difference? So it's a combination of things. But is there a hope for the future of Russia? That it will eventually become a truly democratic country. And that's something that has to happen from inside. You can't declare democracy. You can't just wave a magic wand and say, well, now we're going to be democratic. Because being democratic is here, and it takes a while. And if you've never had that, then you have to learn it. And it's a process, and it's a difficult one. It took most Western countries about 200 years to learn. And I firmly believe that the Russians are not inferior to any other people.
We're still wrestling with it.
And we always will. You never can be completely. I mean, you know, that's one of the things. But it's a great idea, and it's, in my view, It's not a, what's the correct word for this? It's not something that is not attainable. Like, for instance, in my opinion, communism is not attainable because what it asks is for people to be completely different, not to be egoistic, not to want money, not to do this, it's almost like the Ten Commandments, you know, and we know they're wonderful. We're not, none of us, well, I don't know, but at least I'll say for myself, I cannot say that I fully respond to those 10 commandments, right? It's just, these are things that you want to try to do. Whereas democracy is a much more realistic thing, in my opinion. And therefore, I am optimistic for Russians in that sense. If you could go back in time, would you prefer to have remained in America as a teenager? Or are you happy with the outcome of where you are today as a Russian citizen and independent TV journalist? Well, I'm also, as I said, a US citizen and a French citizen. I have 3 passports. And it's a question, you know, first of all, it's a loaded question. And secondly, it's one impossible to answer because I don't know what would have happened to me had we remained in the United States. Who would I be? I would certainly not know much of what I know today. I would certainly not be fluent in Russian. But maybe I would be something completely different and wonderful. Who knows? So I really can't answer that question. When I was living in the Soviet Union and was not allowed to travel, and I was not allowed to travel for nearly 30 years, because I refused to work with the KGB and because of some of the things that I said, I terribly missed America because it's a country I love. And the knowledge that I would never be able to go back was terribly painful. But when all that changed, then everything changed. When you know that you can go, you just pick up and you're gone. And if you miss it, you really can go and, you know, I miss baseball. Well, when I go to New York, I go to Yankee Stadium. Not that the Yankees are, well, this year they're doing pretty well, but I mean, generally speaking, yeah, well, who likes the Red Sox? Not me. Yeah, of course you do. Well, anyway, so, you know, those are little things, but life is made up of little things. It's not the big political issues, but it's how people walk, talk, smile, how they joke, how they eat, how they relate to each other. That's what makes home. And that's, if you've grown up with something and that's taken away from you, somewhat brutally, then that you miss it. Like I miss peanut butter. You know, and because no, now it's not a problem. But here nobody likes peanut butter. You know, they say, yuck, what is this? So these are, you know, these little things are what really affect you. So the fact that I can go whenever I want, that's very important. But whether or not I wish my life would have evolved in another way, I don't think so. I've been very lucky in many, many ways. And what, if anything, do you think Nemtsov's assassination cut short in that evolution? You know, I knew him pretty well. He was a very attractive, charismatic, already not that young, but as a young man, I mean, women fell all over the place when they saw him. He was quite a guy. And he was a real politician. I mean, he would come out on the stage and he would see a woman and he'd say, so how's your son? Is he still in the army? I mean, he remembered people's faces, names, and all of that. He was, you know, he was very good for that. Did he actually change anything? No. He didn't have that much influence. Yeltsin, at a certain time, had kind of hinted that he would groom this man for president. But then that didn't happen. He never did. For whatever reasons, who knows? The fact that he was killed was, of course, terrible. And his killers have still not been found. And, you know, many people have said it's probably Putin because he was very anti-Putin. But if you look at it from a very cold-blooded viewpoint, his murder hurt Putin much more than if he had not been murdered. Because immediately, you know, it's Putin. And otherwise, you know, when he ran for office, he got 0.1% of the vote. He just didn't have the support that he needed. He was a charming man, but he really didn't affect the country in any way. Is there an explanation on so many bad things, poisoning and murders, happening to critics of Putin? Well, if you think, poisonings, are we talking about the Skripals here? This is a couple, right? And then that other couple who supposedly found a bottle that contained the poison that, so let's forget about the ones who found the bottle, okay? I mean, if Russian intelligence was behind this, do you think they'd leave a bottle somewhere? I mean, come on, let's be serious here. They weren't even good at poisoning. I mean, they really didn't get they only killed one person, and it was not one of the Skripals. It was this poor woman, or rather, yeah, the poor woman who found the bottle. Now, what about the Skripals? Why would Putin want to poison them? Well, let's look at this. Skripal was in the GRU. Now, there's the former KGB, which today is the FSB, which is the equivalent, if you will, of the FBI, but it's more than that. But it's also counterespionage and so on. And then there's the GRU, which is Army Intelligence. And those are two different organizations that really don't like each other a lot. So this man was a member of GRU, and he was a colonel. And he spied, and he was caught. That is to say, he spied, and then he went over to the other side, and he was caught by the Russians and brought back and sentenced to 13 years in jail. Now, 13 years in jail for an intelligence officer who betrays his country is really very little. In most countries it would be a lot more. And in wartime you'd be shot, clearly. But this isn't wartime. So, who was the Jewish gentleman who was condemned? Condemned to 30 years he was a spy for Israel. Yeah, the guy who spied for Israel in the United States, right? Yeah, now Israel is an ally, right? And the guy was condemned to 30 years, and they haven't let him out. So this guy, 13, someday they may. So this guy gets 13 years, all right. And then he's exchanged, which is really surprising. He's exchanged for Russian agents or spies who were arrested. Okay, so he goes over to the UK, where he continues to work for British intelligence, telling them what he knows, and when he sees that he has something interesting to say, he meets with them for money. This is official now, right? He gets from $5,000 to $7,000 per meeting. And when the meeting is really of interest, he asks for $10,000. Okay. He's of very little use anymore, this man. Right? I mean, he's no longer part of this establishment. He's pretty much told them everything he knows. Why kill him? I mean, why? There's got to be a reason. Is this vengeance? Is Putin that stupid? I mean, he may be a very dangerous man. I'm not saying that he's not. In fact, I'm not a big fan of Mr. Putin's. But one thing I know for sure, he's not stupid. Why would he do this? Why would he risk it? Why? It makes no sense. It makes no sense to do it. So this thing about poisoning, you get like if you were poisoning everybody, there's this one case, and there's still been no proof. Yes, we have the proof, but we can't tell you because it's secret. What kind of proof is that? So, and yes, some people have been killed. And the question is it Putin who has ordered these killings? In my opinion, it's not. Could it be someone lower? Could it be people, getting revenge or whatever? In the case of let's say, Boris Yefimовich Nemtsov, I think it is. I think it is revenge. And I think I know whose revenge. But it certainly isn't Putin. It has nothing to do with his politics. It has to do with completely different things. In my personal opinion, women. And, and we can go into that if you want. I liked him a lot, but, so did women, and he liked women too. So poisoning and murders. What is your response to U.S. allegations of Russian interference in our elections? Gosh, my response is, show me. That's all. Just show me. And I will say yes, if it's, you know. And if not, then why can't you show me? I really don't get it. I find it difficult to believe that Russian propaganda could really influence a voter somewhere in Iowa to vote for Trump instead of voting for Hillary Clinton. I mean, that would be a feather in the cap of Russian propaganda, believe me. To be able to do that is quite something. I don't think they could. Now, nonetheless, I'm not saying Russia didn't interfere. I'm just saying, please show me in a concrete way how Russia did interfere. And no one's showing me. So as a journalist, I'm saying, look, until I see it, I can't say no, but I can't say yes. And then, you know, there's a presumption of innocence unless you prove otherwise. And again, the different intelligence services of the United States have said that they believe, that they're almost certain. But come on. And that's not happened. I don't understand that at all. I really don't. I think it's counterproductive. And if the Russians did interfere, then that kind of attitude gives them a lot of cards to play. The one that I'm just playing. Show me, you know. Do you believe Russia could westernize without succumbing eventually to the unipolar globalist power players? Well, what is westernize? What does that really mean? Does it mean having fair elections? Does it mean having freedom of speech, at least a great deal of it? Does it mean having independent media? I think it does. And I wish it would happen here. And what does that have to do with globalization or unipolar? I think there's a lot to learn from the way the West evolved. And it's not just the United States, it's Great Britain, it's France. I mean, when you think about the fact that the Magna Carta dates back to what? 1215 or 1015? And look at, and those are the things you want to look at. When that many centuries ago people began thinking about human rights. Is human rights a Western concept? Yes, it is. It certainly is. And I think it's a wonderful concept. And I believe that when Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that man is endowed by his Creator with certain inalienable rights, including the right, among which the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Is that a Western thing? I think it is. And I think it's wonderful. So depending on what you mean by westernizing, depending on that, I would hesitate with an answer. And the last question here, if you were Russia's president, heaven forbid, what would you do beyond what President Putin has done so far? Well, I can't be Russia's president because I hold a citizenship of foreign countries, and I certainly don't want to be. I'm not interested in power, and in fact, I don't trust presidents. I don't trust power structures. People who want power, in my opinion, are usually divided into two groups. There are people who get a kick out of power, and there are people who are kind of messiahs and believe that they know how you should live. And I don't want someone telling me how I should live. So in the case of the government, of a president, it's not something that I trust or would want to be. I think that he's made some serious mistakes. And I think he's responsible for the kind of stalling or rollback of the development of democracy in this country. Because under Gorbachev and then under Yeltsin, democracy was evolving much more quickly, along with a lot of other bad things. But nonetheless, that was happening. I think that in his international relations, he's mainly been right. And let me explain what I mean by that. You know, when Putin became president, one of the first things he did was to apply to the West for two things. A, do away with NATO because there's no more Warsaw Pact. So do away with NATO, which was created to defend against an unpredictable and dangerous Soviet Union, which is no longer there, and create a new military alliance that would include Russia. Number two, consider the possibility of Russia joining the European Union, becoming part of this European family. In both cases, he was told no. Now, in addition to that, gradually he came to the conclusion that the West, and when I do this, it's because there is no West. There is the United States of America. All the other countries of Europe, insofar as policies, Russia policies, accept the American leadership here. It's American leadership, and there are no countries that have said, no, we don't agree, for whatever reasons. So the United States came to the conclusion that the United States, in fact, did not want Russia to come back, did not want Russia to become an independent, strong power. And if you take the time to read something called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, you remember that Paul Wolfowitz was the Deputy Secretary of Defense of the United States. Paul Wolfowitz, terribly sorry. And in 1992, he wrote a paper, he produced a paper about the future development of the United States and its relationship with the rest of the world, in particular with Russia, in which he very clearly stated that, Russia should be kept in check. Senator Kennedy said that paper was an imperialistic paper that should not be and would not be accepted by any other country. The issue is that view, there were two ways of treating Russia. Soviet Union disappeared, no more Soviet Union. So you have this country, Russia. What do you do with it? What is your attitude towards it? There are two possibilities. One is to adopt a kind of Marshall Plan, like the United States did after World War II, and aim money at it, but in a way to make sure that democracy evolves and that the communist system does not come back, like after war, against fascism, against Nazism, against and so on. And that worked very well. So that's one attitude. The other is they made us suffer for 40 years, being, the Russians. They threatened us for 40 years, and now they're going to pay for it. They've lost the Cold War. And so there was this choice. You could do this, or you could do that. And initially, there were a lot of arguments about what to do. I had a former Secretary of Defense of the United States on my show, William Perry. I don't know if you're, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so William Perry on my show said when he learned that Clinton had decided to enlarge NATO, he protested. And he protested very loudly. So finally, they had a big meeting of all the security, defense, and so on. And he was voted down. And he said he wanted to retire, he wanted to leave, because he thought it was a terrible mistake. And he's not the only one who thought that way. But that was, huh?
George Kennan.
Well, yes, George Kennan especially. So the feeling was, what with the bombing of Yugoslavia, the recognition of Kosovo, that the United States was saying to Russia, look, shut up, you lost the Cold War, you're no longer an important country, we're not interested. And what Putin tried to do was to come back a little bit on that. Let's change that. Didn't happen. And so finally, in 2007 in Munich, where he met with the so-called 20, he made this famous speech, or infamous, as you will, depends how you look at it, saying, we no longer are going to accept this kind of treatment. This is a multipolar world, not a unipolar world, and you're going to have to take us into account. We have our interests, and we're going to defend them. And basically, that's when things began to really change in the relationship. And that's also when Putin began to get real support from the people of this country, who felt that they'd been betrayed by Gorbachev, betrayed by Yeltsin because they kept bowing to the United States. And this is a very proud nation, as Americans are. And also, as Americans are, a nation that believes that it has a special mission. You know, the French don't believe that. You know, the French just know that they're better than anyone else, and that's it. So, you know, but you know, the Americans, you know, the city on the hill and all of that, and a special mission. And here there's that same feeling. It's somewhat religious. And suddenly they're being told that they're nobody, that nobody cares about them, that they're no longer of importance. And Putin was the man who said, no, we cannot accept that. We will not. And so in that sense, he brought Russia back, creating the kind of animosity that we now see around in the West vis-a-vis Putin, but also creating this tremendous support that he has from the people. He is a man who is a real patriot of our country, who stands up to the United States. So, to go back to what I was saying, his foreign policy, insofar as the people are concerned here, is absolutely correct. It's absolutely right. And much as I don't like much of what he's done, I understand the necessity of doing several things. The issue of Crimea and of Ukraine is linked directly to NATO. It's simply a fact that the Russians will not accept NATO bases on their border with Ukraine. And that's all there is to it. You know, it's almost like back in the missile crisis. Remember back in the 61, 62?
Absolutely.
When you know, Castro, independent Cuba, absolutely independent, and Khrushchev agreed that Soviet missiles would be placed on Cuban soil. Did they have the right to agree to that? Of course they did. International law doesn't prohibit it. But when the United States learned that this was happening, basically it said either you stop or we're going to sink your ships. And if that leads to World War III, well, so be it. Now that was, insofar as international law is concerned, absolutely not acceptable. But the United States saw there a real existential threat. And therefore, the hell with international law, it said. And that's exactly the same way that Russia sees NATO on its border, as an existential threat.
Does Putin have a line in the sand?
Well, the line in the sand is clear, but the fear that Ukraine going west would be accepted by NATO, and Crimea with Sevastopol, the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, would become the base of the American Sixth Fleet, is simply not acceptable to the Russian leadership. And if you put up a map, you know, I've always said, you know, imagine a map of the United States with Mexico. That's very much like Russia with Ukraine. Now just imagine that in Mexico you have a revolution. Not that difficult to imagine, right? And imagine that it's anti-American, also imaginable, right? And this new government is somewhat afraid of Big Brother up there, right? And what it does, it applies to Russia and said, could you send us 10 divisions to protect our frontier with America? Do you think the United States would accept that?
Absolutely.
You know, of course not. So I say, give it some thought here, you know? Where are the guarantees? After all, it was promised that NATO wouldn't move eastward. Baker promised it. Now that's been published, thank heavens. So Putin, much to my regret, is now almost convinced that you can't trust the Americans, the leadership, obviously. That you know, it just, they'll say one thing, but they'll do something very different. And this level of mistrust is very dangerous, because what you have is the danger of an accidental nuclear exchange. Because back in the days, in other days, we had that danger, you know. In fact, there were two cases when it was announced in the White House at night that the Russians had launched 20 and then 200 missiles. But because of, if you will, the greater degree of trust, they verified that once, they verified that twice, and they only had 10 minutes to do it. And on the third try, it turned out that one of the microchips in one of the computers had malfunctioned. That microchip cost 46 cents. And we could have destroyed the world. But today, they may not even verify. Oh, they've launched? Bang.
Have you seen Oliver Stone's interviews with Vladimir Putin?
Yes.
What are your thoughts on that?
I interviewed him, Stone, not Putin. And I asked him, why didn't you ask tougher questions? Why didn't you go for the jugular? I mean, that kind of thing. And he said, look, I asked the president whether he would allow me to do this. He was very gracious, and I didn't think it right to go for these kind of questions. And let's not forget, Oliver Stone is not an interviewer. He's not an interviewer, and he doesn't do it very well, by the way. He has made some great movies, but interview is not his thing. I think he made a mistake by not asking the really tough questions. He should have, because then people watching those interviews, I think, would have been much more impressed with them than this absence, because immediately the press centered on that, focused on it. Where are the really tough questions?
What questions would you have asked?
Oh, I would have asked about Crimea. I would have asked about democracy in Russia, about what's happening. Why is television controlled by the government? Why isn't there any independent television? Why isn't there any public television? I would have asked about what's happening with elections. Why the elections for so many years have been basically controlled. As someone who lives here, I would have a lot of questions to ask him. Of course, you'd have to know, because you have to know a country before you can really ask questions about it. But I think he could have done a better job
Do you
preparing.
think it discredits what he did?
No.
There is some
Well,
value?
it depends. There is value. I think there is. But again, from the viewpoint of people who are anti-Russian, anti-Putin, it does discredit. They say, see, he's a patsy.
And they did do that.
Oh, of course they did. Yes. Sir, you had a question.
Yes, a couple of days ago, there was a State Department person who testified in front of Congress. It basically said, we're going to box Russia in until they surrender.
Yes.
And we're not going to stop.
Yes.
You're aware of that.
Yes.
So what does this mean? What do you think the future holds?
Well, I think I answered that question. I think it's futile. I think that, this idea, box Russia in, means what?
Well, they wanted to balkanize Russia. That was a big resistance.
Well, so the problem with that, if you look at the Balkans, the countries that were created after World War I, that is to say Yugoslavia, made up of different pieces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and a somewhat artificial group of countries. It's very different from Russia. Russia is not an artificially, put together country. It's a very ancient one with its history and so on. I think that that gentleman is making a very serious mistake. And what I really fear is, not long ago, someone asked Putin a question, what do we do if we find that we can't exist anymore? And his answer was, well, we don't need a world where we don't exist.
We don't need a world.
We don't need a world where we don't exist. So, it's kind of playing with fire,
Yes.
that kind of thing. It's a very irresponsible approach. Yes, sir.
Well, two questions. One, taking off from that, is this attitude, boxing Russia in, increasing sanctions and so forth, going to enhance or slow down progress in Russia towards democracy and so forth that you were describing before? And the other question I wanted to ask is, the anti-Americanism and anti-Russianism that you described earlier,
Yes.
did that begin with Munich essentially? Is it tied to the...
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, let me answer the first question. The first question is definitely yes, it does slow down, retard, and push back the development of democracy in this country, and plays right into the hands of the more reactionary people in this country, the more anti-Western people in this country. It gives them all the cards. They say, see, we can't have relations with these people because all they want is to destroy us. They're saying so. They want us to surrender. Now, what does surrender mean? Surrender means regime change. It means get rid of Putin and put in someone we like, which is what the United States has done in many countries, sometimes with military force, sometimes not. Iraq, Lebanon, Afghanistan, not too well, and so, but still, you know? So it plays into the most anti-democratic forces that exist in this country. That's point number one. Point number two, there was a period with Gorby and with Yeltsin at the beginning when that all kind of disappeared. Because in fact, there was such a huge sigh of relief that we're not threatening each other anymore, that we're not going to destroy each other. Let's not forget that people of your age, when they were children, were taught to hide under desks during possible, Soviet raids and so on. That wasn't the case here. They didn't do it that way. But still, the idea, right? And then suddenly, unexpectedly, it's all over. We are now friends. It's Gorby and so on and so forth. So this huge sigh of relief, and then just very gradually. I think it all began a little bit earlier. I think it all began with the enlargement of NATO. And George Kennan said it so clearly. He said, this is a tragic mistake. It will lead to a basic change in Russian policy. And that change will affect all of us. Why? The stupidity of that decision. Adopt first, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, and then on and on and on until it reached Soviet borders. I mean, just when you think about it, it's what is scary is the lack of intelligence behind these decisions. And the belief that you can actually somehow close down Russia as if it weren't there. It's really amazing. In I forget what year exactly, the pension age in the Soviet Union was established at 55 for women and 60 for men, the youngest pension age anywhere. Now, to pay pensions, you have to have two things. You have to have taxes, right? And you have people who pay the taxes. That is to say, people who work. What has happened in Russia over the years is people have had fewer and fewer children. And today, the workforce is relatively small. The taxes that we pay in Russia, it's a flat tax. It's the same for everybody. It's 13%. Your income tax is 13%. And if you are what is called an individual entrepreneur, which is to say, you are in a business of your own, but you're all alone. You can't hire anybody. Like say, you're a professional photographer, okay? Then you only pay 6%. So that's to stimulate, So the pension fund, as it turns out, today is not able to pay out even the meager pensions that exist, and believe me, they're not high. So what do you do in that case? Well, you have two possibilities. Either and people are living longer, what's more. So you can shoot all the old people, that's one way of doing it. But that is not being considered, right? I'm kind of kidding you. So, and in every other country, including the United States, the pension age is higher. So finally, the decision is taken that we have to increase the age. There's no choice in the matter. And when Putin says, I'm against it, but there's no way out. So initially, the idea was women 65, men 67, I believe. But of course, the people who worked this out realized that there would be very loud complaints. Nobody likes what you're used to be changed, especially if you're used to something nice, like retiring at 55. So they figured out that they would introduce this And then Putin, the great savior, would come around and say, yes, but. And so instead of women retiring at 65, they will retire at 60. So age came down. And that is going to have, on a gradual, every 2 years, the pension age will go up by 1 year. So it's a gradual process. And hopefully, the pension will also become higher itself. There'll be more money for pensioners. So that's the way it's looked at. For most people, the idea is, oh, I thought I was going to retire tomorrow and I'm not happy with that. Well, what can you do? It's, you know, this country is not rich enough or well off enough or economically developed enough to have the lowest pension age in the world. It just is not possible. The pension, according to UN standards, the pension is supposed to be at least 40% of what you earned, average. And here it's more like 30. So the pensions are very low. What's going to happen to the ruble? Well, you should one of the questions you want to ask is, what about sanctions? Because they affect the ruble, right?
Well, the economy's pretty bad right now.
Well,
because-
that's one of the reasons. It is, of course. So what are the Russians supposed to do in that case?
They're pretty cynical and they're very, very upset about it.
Yes, they are upset. A lot of people are upset. And there's not much that any of us can do about that. There are people who are better off. But by and large, the sanctions have hurt the economy. They continue to hurt the economy. The ruble has gone down vis-a-vis the dollar. It's very difficult to develop the economy because we cannot buy on credit the kind of equipment, machinery and so on that we need to develop the economy, because it won't be sold to us because of the sanctions. So one of the things that people are told is, well, you ask the Americans why you're living the way you are. Because I can tell you, and this is something I can vouch for, in this country today, the leadership would like to have better relations with the United States. There's no doubt about it. Would like to have a partnership if possible. Forget about friendship, but a partnership. And so here, they're open to that. When I did what was called a space bridge many years ago. This was 1986. Phil Donahue in Seattle and Vladimir Pozner in Leningrad. And it was called a Citizens Summit. And we had 250 people in Seattle and 250 people in Leningrad talking to each other, right? And it was the most amazing thing because originally they yelled at each other. And then only gradually they began to talk to each other. Well, I suggested, why not try something like that again? And on this side, government-controlled television said yes. And on that side, no. You see what I'm saying? So it's almost like, well, that side just doesn't want improvement. In fact, is looking to make things worse. Well, look, I'm not in politics, right? I have no influence on what Mr. Putin does and what he decides to do and what the government does. That's not at all my area. I think that basically the Russians would like to see an improvement of relations, that they understand the dangers of the present day. I don't think the idea of having China as an enemy is a good one. No. I don't think so at all. I don't think that we should be looking for enemies, but we should be looking for ways to balance the situation. And I do think that a Russian-American, American-Russian partnership would be a very positive influence in the world today, including China. It's realized very well that China has a huge appetite and a lot of people. And Russia has a vast territory and not that many people. And that, China keeps looking at the Siberian expanses and all of the Far East, and so clearly understanding that there's a danger there. But on the other hand, the U.S. sanctions are pushing Russia towards China and towards the East in general, as more receptive and more willing to trade with Russia and so on. So that's one thing. As far as the mistakes that he's made, I think that his main mistake is the assumption that the Russian people are not ready for democracy. And based on that assumption, he's done whatever he's done. And the question I always ask is, who is the person who's going to say, now they're ready? Who is this wise man who knows all these things? Democracy is very messy. You know, how do you learn to swim? Well, if you don't get into the water, you'll never learn. So when you start getting involved in democracy, some people will drown, and you'll have some negative things. But you'll never learn democratic process if you don't try it. And the idea that we're going to wait until the people have evolved enough to deal with democracy is simply a very strange idea. And then I've often thought, what about yourself, Mr. Putin? Are you ready for democracy? And the answer is no. So that's his basic mistake, and his, as I see it, of course, is his view of and understanding of who the Russians are. And from there, so it's basically internal policy that I'm referring to. Well, Russians really don't think much about him, quite frankly. It's not something that most Russians think about. They think about, is my son or is my husband going to be killed in Syria? That, yes. But it's not about Assad. Now, here's what I would say. You have this man who, let's say, was elected president and became a dictator. And a popular movement evolved against him. To me, this is a Syrian affair. It is their business. I don't see why the United States should get involved, and I don't see why Russia should get involved. But for whatever reasons, approximately in 2011, the West made a decision. Assad has to go. Now, who are you to decide whether Assad has to go or not? If he's attacking your country, yes. But this is a domestic issue. There's a fight going on inside Syria. And there's also interest in different countries, the United States for one, Russia for another, in having some kind of influence in that part of the world. So the United States goes in supporting the so-called moderate opposition, moderate in cutting off heads, but still very moderate. And then the Russians say, well, if the Americans are going to go in, why can't we go in? And so the Russians go in. And there now you have this, I don't know what you'd call it, this situation. My opinion is, don't get involved. It's none of your business. It's the UN, fine. The UN, human rights, send in UN forces, that's a different situation. But when one country decides that it has the right to get in and do something, I think it's a mistake, quite frankly.
A little lighter.
Sure.
I was so favorably impressed when, from the airport on and arriving in Moscow and seeing the cleanliness, the modernization, the efficiency of the subway, etc. Very impressive. I've talked to several Russians along the way in our last few days, and they said, well, that's just in the last 10 years. Things have really greatly improved. My question has been from the economic standpoint, where did all this money, what's supporting all this sudden advancement in the last 10 years, particularly? What's going on?
The change in the economic structure, that is to say, the fact that capitalism to a certain point has been allowed to evolve here. You have private ownership. You have business. And you have business that's interested in investing and getting returns. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, of course, the oil and gas boom that happened over that period brought in huge amounts of money. So I think those are the two main sources. Now things are getting tough because of the sanctions and because, well, oil is still pretty much at the same level. It fluctuates a little bit, but it's still relatively high. So that brings in the revenue. And then Moscow, of course, well, you're going to travel around the country, and you'll see that Moscow is not Russia. Not any more than New York is, but even more so. You'll find that other cities are not anywhere near as developed and don't have the same affluence and so on. Moscow in that sense is a pretty special place where it's very centralized. To a certain extent, we're mindful of France and Paris, which is a centralized place, or London for that matter. So you'll see the difference.